He unrolled the map and his fingertip paused on the fresh stain. Suspicion pushed his shoulders forward. He tapped the burned center with a stained fingernail and held the parchment up under candlelight. The occult cartographer saw the smudge settle into a pit of ink and red dye and read the new sigil sewn into the margin. "This is new," he said, and his voice cut the scriptorium's hush. The room understood the problem at once. The map placed hell inside a known pilgrimage site, and that placement would alter both law and pilgrimage routes. He had bent over maps his whole adult life. He knew worm-eaten folds, water hallows, the way medieval glue darkened with age. Now suspicion sat under his ribs like a coin pressed into skin, and he let it steer him. He ran a thumb over the sigil. The ink had pooled into a black crater. Paper fibers were singed at the edges. He smelled beeswax, saw parchment, and the sharp tang of iron from fresh ink. Lady Isolde leaned forward. "Isolde," he said, naming her because he wanted the exchange to be specific. She drew back a sleeve and laid a gloved hand near the margin without touching it. "It lies on the road to St. Vernon," she said. Her voice was careful. "If men believe hell sits there, they will avoid the road or bring banners to cleanse it. That changes who holds power around the shrine." Prior Aldemar watched from the doorway with his hands folded. He did not take a step closer. Matteo, the journeyman scribe, lifted a magnifying glass and peered at the marginalia. "This shorthand is demonological. I have seen it once before in a ledger from the abbey at Montferrand." He folded his mouth around the words as if tasting them. "The cartographer who copied the ledger." Matteo did not answer immediately. He tapped the glass against his lip. The cartographer's suspicion hardened into a question. Who had the means and motive to replace a cartographic truth with damnation? He knew how maps shaped behavior. He had written notations to warn colonists away from bogs, and he had erased errors that led merchants onto broken roads. Now someone weaponized cartography. He pushed his spectacles up, the brass frames catching candlelight, and began to catalogue damage. "Prior Aldemar, whose custody is this map under?" Aldemar's reply came smooth and practiced under the chapter's care. "It guides pilgrims. It instructs clergy on where to send processions and where to place sanctified stones. Then why mark hell where saints walk?" The cartographer. Aldemar did not answer the question directly. He pointed instead to a fold. "Authority must sometimes frighten to teach order, Aldemar." A cold knot tightened in the cartographer's throat. Suspicion shifted into doubt. He wondered if Aldemar believed the mark was a moral instrument, or merely accepted a story he had been told. The cartographer: "If authority marks a place as hell, people will go armed or stop going. It will tip trade and tax income, and it will justify liturgical action. Who profits from that change?" Lady Isolde stared at the burn and then at Aldemar. "If it brings pilgrims away," she said, "it sends them to my lord's lands. We have suffered from the shrines, levies for years." Her mouth tightened, and she named the political angle plainly. Matteo returned to the table and began to lift margins with a scalpel, careful and methodical. His hands trembled enough that the cartographer noticed. "Matteo, the cartographer, you worked when this map was last repaired. Did you see any new sewing or fresh adhesives?" Matteo glanced at the cartographer and said, "There was a small repair 2 weeks ago. Brother Anselm brought this to us. He left a sealed strip of linen and a satchel of glue. I repaired the edge and did the binding." The cartographer's doubt sharpened into pressure. Brother Anselm's name forced the possibility that an internal hand had altered the map. They worked in silence while Matteo peeled back layers. The cartographer watched the underside of the parchment as if it might whisper. He found stitches that did not match the original work. A coarser thread, a repeating knot that matched a pattern Matteo had seen in a patron's binding. Someone resewed the backing and inserted a cipher slip. Matteo. Eyes on the stitch. Someone wanted this alteration to look like repair. The cartographer copied the stitch style with a fingernail. He felt the paper's new tension under his nail and let the sensation guide him. A loud knock fractured the scriptorium's careful work. The cartographer did not move first. Lady Isolde straightened and called, "Enter." Brother Anselm stepped in, breath heavy from the corridor. followed by a hooded emissary whose face the shadow refused to let settle. Anselm did not look at the map. He looked at the cartographer and said, "Brother Matteo informs me repairs were made." His tone avoided accusation and delivered duty. "We require a confirmation that the map remains sanctioned." The cartographer kept his eyes on the burn. "It has been altered." He watched the two men's faces for a flicker. Aldemar crossed the room then, the hem of his robe whispering. "Altered to instruct the faithful," he said, "to mark danger for the unlearned." The cartographer pressed a thumb against the burned sigil. The paper had not cooled. He felt a slight give, almost a pulse. Alarm arose, sharp and bodily. He withdrew his thumb quickly and drew cloth across the mark. Matteo's hands hovered over a separate sheet. "We should test whether this is inert or active." "Matteo." They moved the map to the central table. The cartographer insisted on ritual notation. Small, controlled marks to trace the previous line and a precise ink application to counter the sigil. He prepared iron gall once more because the old inks reacted to correction. "Matteo," he said, "you steady the margins." "I will add the notation." Matteo set down a thin bone-handled quill. He nodded. "Steady," he said. They began. The cartographer drew a correction line, minute and exact. He spoke in short sentences, naming the stroke before he made it. "Trace the gulf. Draw the coast in miniature. Anchor the pilgrimage road." He tapped his fingertip to the map, a small ritual of measurement. He felt suspicion slide into resolve. The cartographer believed the map could be corrected, and that correction might undo whatever influence the new mark had. Halfway through the notation, the ink pooled differently. The correction line darkened faster than it should. Tiny fissures spidered outward from the burn along the coastline they had drawn. Matteo's breath stopped. "It moves," he said. "The line is alive." The cartographer's hands tightened. Alarm exploded into outright fear when the map's ink rose like a slow tide, and the fissures widened into hairline gaps. Lady Isolde reached across the table and snatched the quill. "Stop!" she said, and her voice held command. "Stop that hand. If you continue, we do not know what will wake." Prior Aldemar's jaw set. He strode around the table and seized the map's corner. He aimed to pin it with his palm. The cartographer pulled back his hand. "Let it breathe," he said. His voice was low but urgent. "We must test, not burn it blind." Aldemar's fingers dug into the parchment. "No, a gate cannot be allowed." The room split between caution and force. The emissary moved then, and the emissary's gloved hand laid a sealed note on the table. Brother Anselm opened the seal with a small knife and slid the strip of linen out. He read quickly, then read aloud a single line. "The mark must remain until the council confirms spiritual hazard." Lady Isolde's eyes flicked to the emissary and back. "Who signed this?" she asked. Anselm's face tightened. "A noble voice we do not name in public." The cartographer felt a shift. Suspicion became the need to know who paid for silence. They argued in short bursts. "You cannot order the map to terrify the road, Lady Isolde. You cannot send peasants away and tax the side roads. We do what preserves souls." Aldemar replied, "We shepherd them from sin. Shepherds take sheep to pasture." Isolde shot back, "You place a cliff instead." Brother Anselm intervened with 3 clipped lines. "Isolde, Aldemar, Matteo, enough. The chapter must decide. The emissary bears word from a patron." Matteo looked at the cartographer and said, "I watched the stitch. I can find the hand that tied it. I can track who sent the linen." His voice had a stubborn edge. The cartographer watched feet move, watched the emissary's cloak fold. He noticed the emissary's boots were scuffed in a way Matteo matched a messenger route to the western manor. The cartographer compared that detail with Isolde's hint about tolls. He felt suspicion roll into a hypothesis. A secular patron had ordered the change to redirect pilgrims. That hypothesis demanded proof. After Aldemar left for council, tension eased for a moment. Matteo and the cartographer stayed. Matteo whispered, "Brother Anselm will not admit a secular order if it comes from his patron. He protects the monastery with his silence for reasons I cannot search openly." The cartographer, "Then we test the maps without claiming authority. We will attempt a correction that both hides and exposes the mark." He drew a tiny loop at the map's rim where the coastline met the burn. "If the map resists, We will know whether the mark acts like a talisman or like a story told on parchment. If it resists, then someone bound it with intent. Matteo placed a lamp close and held it steady. They made the correction quietly at first. The cartographer spoke each stroke. He relied on precise measurements and the silver signet ring he used as a compass. As he worked, the air in the scriptorium felt thicker. The cartographer's pulse rose. He felt fear again, this time as a physical clench at his ribs. The ink pulled. A hairline gap widened under his quill now. Matteo breathed. Now the fissure shows a glow at the seam. The cartographer hesitated. He looked at Matteo's eyes for a reading and found that Matteo had gone pale. A scraping noise began, not from the map but from the pane of glass in the scriptorium window. Sounds from the cloister courtyard shifted. Boots halted and then scattered. The cartographer's chest tightened. He pushed a line of correction across the burn and the paper shivered like a struck string. Then, without warning, the parchment split along the newly drawn fissure and a column of flame and shadow rose from the map's center. The room became a raw, elemental space. Flame poured upward in a narrow pillar, black smoke braided into it. The cartographer shoved the table back and shouted, "Get back!" Matteo yanked a secretary chair and shoved it between the flame and the door. Prior Aldemar dove forward with a censer and swung incense toward the upthrust column. Lady Isolde snatched a cloak and beat at the smoke. The emissary dropped to one knee and prayed aloud in a tongue the cartographer did not know. In the chaos, the cartographer saw movements that read as choices. Aldemar barked an order, "Seal it with holy iron." Isolde answered, "Seal it under oath to my lord. He will guard the road." Aldemar's face flushed. "Do not name lords in the presence of a gate." The cartographer reached for a strip of linen and a bottle of old wine. He thought of sealing the fissure with ritual notation, not with politics. "No," he said loudly. "Listen, we do this by measure, not by claim." The flame hissed. It tuned itself to a frequency the cartographer felt in his teeth. Matteo cried out as the table he had leaned on smoked at one corner. "The map resists removal," he shouted. "It answers ink with fire." He lunged for a scorched edge and produced, with shaky fingers, a cipher slip stitched into the map's backing. He thrust it at the cartographer. "They sewed this in after you left the binding room, by command." "Matteo, I found it under the seam just now. I did not sew it. I swear it to you." The cartographer caught the slip. His hands smelled of singed linen. The emissary leaned forward and said, "You should yield the slip to the chapter. It bears a seal." "It is the chapter's right," Aldemar agreed. Isolde's jaw clenched. The cartographer watched their faces and then unfolded the slip. The handwriting inside matched neither the abbey's hand nor Matteo's. It suggested a clerk trained by a noble office. The cartographer's mind snapped to the political map he had held together in other repairs. Money followed pilgrims. He thought of markets that would move, of bell towers hearing fewer masses, and of a noble house that would gain from an exodus. Aldemar stepped forward and demanded the slip. "Give it to me," he said. "I will deliver it to council." Matteo's voice came in lines short and sharp. "If you hand it to council, who will read it? Who will hide its signature?" The emissary's hood rustled. "Brother Anselm, nothing." The cartographer made his choice. He folded the cipher slip into his palm, feeling the crease, and he pressed it into a private lining inside his satchel. He had learned long ago the difference between what the chapter must know to act and what the world must not yet possess. "Aldemar, you will convene the council, and I will present a corrected annotation. We will argue its necessity in private first." He met Aldemar's eyes without flinching. "If we shout accusal now, we break the map and we break people's lives. We must prove motive before we shame a name." Aldemar's expression went cold and slow. He did not like being told to wait. They extinguished the larger flames with wet cloaks and iron tongs. Smoke clung to the rafters. The map lay partly cleaved, the burned pit black and slick. The cartographer felt tired in his hands and heavy behind his eyes. "We will bind the damaged edge and add a coded notation to the map's ledger. We will not announce the gate." Matteo nodded. His shoulders were slumped. Isolde pressed a gloved thumb to the map and then withdrew it quickly. When the immediate chaos ended, the The cartographer sat with Matteo in the scriptorium's back corner. Matteo handed him the cipher slip again. "If what I say is true," Matteo whispered, "the stitches not matches Master Hervin's pattern at the Western Manor. He owes no allegiance to the Abbey when gold calls." The cartographer folded the slip and pressed his knuckles together. He quietly, "Then we must follow the stitch back to that hand. We must not accuse Master Hervin without proof. We need names, witnesses. We need to see the patron's seal in daylight." Suspicion loosened into purpose. A midnight watchman rapped the scriptorium shutter. Footsteps passed outside. The cartographer closed the ledger and wrote a small coded notation inside the map's record. A single line in cipher that only he could read. He did not note the presence of the burn in plain script. He marked the ledger to trigger a private dossier if future damage appeared. Matteo stood. "I will go to the binding room at dawn and look for the tools that made that stitch. I will ask the apprentices." He set his jaw. "I will not say Brother Anselm's name. I will speak of tools. If they lie, their hands will betray them." The cartographer felt a small surge of approval. The cartographer, "Take care. If someone is willing to bind hell to a road, they will watch for nosy hands." Matteo left with the cipher in his pocket. The cartographer went through the chest of maps and found a blank folio. He placed the ruined mappamundi inside, folded it with careful motions, and tied it with a cloth strip. He slid the cipher slip into the fold between parchment and backing. The ritual of concealment felt clinical and necessary rather than emotional. He locked the chest and set the key in a drawer under a stack of parchments. Before dawn, as the first grey light bled into the leaded windows, the cartographer wrote a short report and pinned it beneath the drawer key. A line that only Matteo and he would read. He wrote facts, repair dates, stitch patterns, the emissary's arrival, Brother Anselm's delivery, and the patron's hinted interest. He did not assign guilt. He sealed his satchel and set his spectacles on top. He arranged his bone, handled quill, and checked the signet ring at his finger. He breathed out and felt his chest unclench, his suspicion now tempered into a precise plan. He would follow the stitch. He would interview the apprentices. He would trace the emissary's boots. He would find the patron's seal in sunlight. He rose and held the map chest key. He slid the key into his pocket and shut the study door with 2 deliberate motions. The final sound of the bolt fell clean. He listened for footsteps in the corridor. He heard a soft knock at the outer door. He paused, folded the cipher slip back into the lining of his satchel, and lifted the latch. The knock repeated, hesitant and human. The chapter ended on that knock, an immediate, situational beat that demanded a next deliberate choice. Emotionally, the chapter had moved from suspicion to alarm and then to guarded resolve. Suspicion initiated every decision and pushed the cartographer to act. Alarm forced responses in the scriptorium. Resolve guided the concealment and the quiet plan. The smaller shifts, doubt to pressure, curiosity to fear, and fear to pragmatic action, appeared in his hands, in the way he wrote, and in the lines he spoke aloud. He did not declare feelings, he used his hands to show them. The way he pressed linen into the fold, the way he tapped the map margin, the way he locked the chest. He had 3 names to carry forward: Matteo, who had soon and then confessed his finding; Lady Isolde, who eyed political advantage; Prior Aldemar, who justified doctrine; and Brother Anselm, who delivered the repair. Each name now counted as an actor who would influence the next move. The map itself had become a weapon and a secret. The cartographer's choice to hide the cipher required responsibility. Outside, the cloister bell struck the hour. The cartographer set his satchel over his shoulder and moved toward the outer door. He did not say what he would do next. He only placed his hand on the latch, felt the metals cold, and then opened the door to a shadowed figure waiting on the threshold. He slammed the map down on the oaken table, and the stained center caught every torchlight in the hall. Suspicion tightened his jaw as bishops and nobles bent toward the smear. The room smelled of boiled leather and old candle wax. The immediate problem sat flat and visible. The map placed a dark pit within the bishopric's own borders, and men in power had to decide whether to display or destroy it. The occult cartographer stood with his palms on the parchment. He kept his voice low. "Look here," he said. This mark was inked after the prime survey. His hand tapped the red stain. He did not allow silence to drift. The tapping became a measure, a way to hold attention. Within those first exchanges, his suspicion pushed him into action. He had not come to argue theory. He had come to force a choice. He had the sextant, the folded provenance, the pressed seal from a distant abbey. He presented them on the table where clerics could not ignore the facts. Bishop Aldrich drew himself up and let his fingers graze his rosary before speaking. "Bishop Aldrich, how can we accept this?" Noble Steward Henry spread his hands and leaned forward with a calculating look. "Noble Steward Henry, if true, pilgrims will come. Pilgrims mean tolls." His voice kept a number in it more than a prayer. The senior monk, Brother Martin, stepped closer and examined the marginalia with a hand that trembled slightly. "Senior monk Martin, this sigil is recent. It smells of dye, not age." His words cut toward procedure. The cartographer's suspicion shifted. He expected clerical alarm. He did not expect immediate financial calculation. They moved past generalities into facts. The scribe, a thin man named Elias, produced a magnifying lens and held it to the red stain. He lifted a brow. "Scribe Elias, these strokes are layered over earlier cartography. Someone added this later." His voice picked out a detail that pulled the room into narrower focus. Argument began within 5 minutes. The bishop demanded sanctification. The monk called for burning. The steward suggested public exhibition and a chapel fee. Voices rose in quick, clipped exchanges. "Bishop Aldrich, burn it, seal the place, close the road." "Noble Steward Henry, show it, charge for passage, advertise penance." "Senior monk Martin, you would profit on souls." The cartographer interjected with a steady phrase and a small movement. He opened the satchel and set 3 folded documents on the table. "These records show the survey route. These seals match the ink analysis." This was placed and named with intent. His motion was precise. He let the evidence speak, the part of him that suspicion could not prove on its own. A brittle shift came when the emissary burst in from the corridor. He slammed the door and drew a breath so harsh that several turned. Emissary Roland. Villagers found dead near the marked pit. Fog that will not lift. That new fact changed the room's arithmetic. The steward's calculation narrowed into alarm. The monk's insistence hardened into urgency. The bishop's hesitation lengthened into a worry that pressed at his temple. The cartographer's suspicion turned to concern and then to a cold clarity. The map was not merely a political instrument. It might be an active hazard. They walked to the map together. The emissary pointed at a smudge of ink and dirt at the pit's edge, and the cartographer knelt to touch it. The scent there was not only old glue and pigment. He drew back from a faint metallic tang at the edge of the stain. He felt the hair on his forearm lift. He did not name fear. He showed it by moving his hand away and by the steadiness of his breath as he looked up. "Scribe Elias for permission to sample the ink." "Scribe Elias, let me take a scrap. If it is modern dye, we can trace the supplier. He worked by habit." The steward watched the scribe with sharp eyes that added new angles to the council's motive. The bishop folded his hands and asked the cartographer about provenance. "Bishop Aldrich, who brought this to you? Who vouched for it?" His voice was quieter now. It carried the need to know who to trust. The cartographer named names, places, dates. He referenced the sealed abbey that had sent him the first lead. He mentioned the morning he found the smudge in the scriptorium and the way the ink blued under candlelight. He recalled the scrap of sigil sewn into the margin from the earlier parchment. He laid that memory of observation into the room like another document. The emotion shifted again as the scribe lifted his lens and froze. He held out a torn corner. "Scribe Elias, this fiber is not from our parchment." It was slid under the map later. His discovery tightened the debate. Accusation formed in the space between men. Noble Steward Henry's mouth thinned. "Noble Steward Henry, who benefits if we show this? Who profits if we hide it?" He repeated the words as if testing them on the table. Brother Martin answered with a line that had weight. "Senior monk Martin, we profit no more than we sin if we sell fear. We must cleanse what we cannot explain." His finger pointed at the map as if to pin its guilt. The council split into factions. The cartographer kept quiet and watched each face. He watched Bishop Aldrich's momentary softening when the steward suggested pilgrim fees. He watched the monk's jaw set when the emissary described the fog's persistence. Each face gave him more data. In a side chamber, the steward demanded a closer look at the cartographer's instruments. He loud enough for the corridor to hear Noble Steward Henry. "Where is your proof? Who certified your sextant?" The cartographer produced the brass-rimmed sextant and a small sealed note from a coastal surveyor. He offered each item to the steward to inspect. "The tool is mine. The seal is theirs. You may test both." He measured his words like calibrating an instrument. Scribe Elias and the steward argued in clipped lines while the cartographer stood between them. The scribe wanted a scrap taken to the abbey for ink analysis. The steward wanted immediate profit. On the table the map lay like raw evidence, its stained center now the hinge of their ethics and economics. An outside sound broke the argument. A farmer's voice, urgent and thin, swallowed by the hall's door. A second emissary arrived, breathless second emissary. Cattle dead near the brook. Children coughing in the nearby hamlet. The new arrivals piled fresh consequence onto the council that had been debating theory. This external event pushed the scene into a narrower corridor of urgent choices. The bishop called for a vote. He looked to each man in turn. "Bishop Aldrich, we must decide now. Exhibit or bury." His eyes landed on the cartographer with a question that was also a demand. They voted in measured phrases, one name at a time. The steward and two minor nobles voted to exhibit. Brother Martin and two monks voted to destroy. The bishop hesitated, then cast his vote for sequestration and study under lock. The split left neither side satisfied. The cartographer felt pressure from every angle. That pressure moved him to action. He pulled the map closer and placed his hands over the stained center, not to hide it, but to hold the object's truth in one place. "I will not have this used as bait for pilgrims," he said. "I ask that it be secured and studied without sermon or sale." He spoke with measured force. His words were not a plea. They were a directive rooted in the observation he trusted. A tense attempt at negotiation followed. The steward offered the cartographer a public appointment if he would present the map under the chapel's watch. Brother Martin demanded oaths. Bishop Aldrich for a sanctified seal. Each proposal was a concrete device to control the map's social effect. Outside the council chamber, a guard posted at the corridor door tapped his spear against the stone. The cartographer watched the guard's fingers curl around the haft and understood how quickly an order could become a chain. This recognition changed the tenor of his next move. He would conceal nothing unlawful, but he would also safeguard secrets that the council might weaponize. The atmosphere tightened when the map reacted. The stain at the center darkened as if someone had poured more dye onto it. A thin lace of flame rose a handspan above the parchment. No one spoke at first. The heat pressed against faces, and several swept their hands over their cheeks. A low whisper rose from the margins as marginal demons inked in brown uncurl and stretched. The scribe stepped back and dropped his lens. "Scribe Elias, the ink moves." "The ink moves," his voice fractured into a shorter cadence. The room's previous calculation collapsed into immediate alarm. Guards surged forward. One grabbed the cartographer's robe. The cartographer did not struggle. He allowed the hand to close and instead turned his head and spoke with a controlled cadence. "The map is not mere ink. It reacts. If you take it to the public, you will turn a hazard into spectacle." His voice held both warning and a precise direction for action. Bishop Aldrich shouted orders and two guards hauled the map from the table. Noble Steward Henry lunged toward the map, and then stopped when a flare of heat singed the nearest chair. Hissing at the singe, he hissed through clenched teeth, "Noble Steward Henry, we will control this. We will display it under guard." Brother Martin raised his voice with a short, urgent command. "Senior Monk Martin. Stop. Seal it now. We must not let it burn or inspire more." The guard on the cartographer did not intend violence. He gripped the cartographer's arm and held him steady while others argued. The cartographer's breath shortened and sweat gathered at his temples. He met the bishop's gaze and nodded once, a small concession. He would accept the bargain offered in the shadows, promised silence for safe custody. He also slid a folded scrap of annotated parchment from his pocket and kept it in his fist. A rapid exchange erupted between the steward and the monk. 3 quick lines of argument cut across the hall. Noble Steward Henry, we earn coin from pilgrims. Senior Monk Martin, you profane penitence for profit. Noble Steward Henry, and you would hide danger from the folk. The bishop slammed his fist on the table to break the back and forth. Bishop Aldrich, seal it in the archive until proper men examine it. Not public, not destroyed without study. His solution split the difference, but left a thin bitterness. At midnight the map was moved. The cartographer watched the servants carry the parcel into a narrow stair and then down into a hidden archive below the chapter house. The vault door creaked and closed. He stood at the threshold and felt the iron grating lock into place. For a moment, relief eased his shoulders. Then the steward approached him in the dim corridor and offered a bargain in a low voice. Noble Steward Henry, swear an oath of silence, and you will be named the official keeper of the map study. The cartographer's hands tightened on his satchel. His finger found the folded scrap he had concealed. He accepted the oath with a measured nod, but did not hand over the scrap. He kept it pressed against his rib as if it were proof and fuel. He returned to his cellars and laid out the documents by candlelight. He opened the folded scrap. Inside was a note in a hand he had seen before in the scriptorium. A short list of coordinates and a single name. The name matched a man who had once argued for maps that enforced moral order. The cartographer realized the earlier day in the scriptorium, when the smudge had settled into a pit of ink and red dye, had not been an accident. Someone had placed hell on the map to direct people and power. He set the scrap back into his satchel and checked his instruments. The sextant still held its calibration. The brass ring of his signet matched his memory of the compass rose. He felt suspicion mutate into resolve. He would pursue this quietly. He would keep records. He would test the ink at a distance. He would not let the map become a lever used without study. Later that night a muffled knock came at his door. A scribe slipped a scrap under his shutter. The scrap contained a single sentence and a new datum. Someone had observed lights over the marked pit the previous week. The cartographer read it and folded the note into his satchel. This small reveal changed the shape of his intent. The map had followers, and those followers left traces. He put his satchel on and left the scriptorium through a service door. The corridor smelled of damp stone. He moved with a soft, methodical step, keeping his robe from brushing the cold floor. Outside, a small group of villagers clustered at the edge of the keep, speaking in low tones. One of them, a woman with ink stains on her fingers, met his gaze. Villager. They came in the fog. We found a boy by the brook. He had marks like a smith's scorch. The cartographer listened and marked details. Scorch marks, timing, direction. He collected each concrete fact like a sample. He did not promise immediate remedy. He promised the closest thing he had, attention and a record. At dawn, the bishop sent 2 guards to fetch the cartographer to the archive. They brought him down to the vault and set the map on a stone table. The parchment lay flat under iron clamps. The cartographer knelt and examined the stain. He traced the edge with his fingertip until he found a thread of red dye that did not belong to the parchment sleeve. He extracted it with careful fingers and wrapped it in clean linen. Scribe Elias waited with instruments. He worked a small scraping and prepared a vial. The cartographer watched every motion. When the vial closed, the cartographer sealed it with wax and his compass, ringed signet. He placed the sealed vial inside the satchel next to the folded scrap. The bishop spoke in a small voice as the cartographer rose. Bishop Aldrich, we will test this beyond our priory. If it is false, we will make amends. If not, we will act. His sentence carried a weight of governance rather than fury. They agreed to send the sample to a foreign chemist and to appoint the cartographer as a technical advisor for the study. Noble Steward Henry left the vault with fingers that smudged faintly red, already computing possible revenues. Brother Martin wrote an order for prayers over the hamlet. The emissary returned to the road with instructions to bar travelers. At the threshold, the cartographer paused. He looked back at the locked vault and felt the iron's cool ring under his palm. He remembered the emissary's breathless report of dead villagers, and the way the ink had lifted flame. He folded his hands once and then, in a small movement no one saw, pulled the folded scrap from his satchel and tucked it into an inner seam of his robe. He would keep this secret as he kept his instruments, close, private, and ready for use. The chapter closed on a concrete action. The map lay behind iron and wax. The cartographer walked into the pre-dawn light with a sealed vial, a hidden scrap, and a measured plan to test the map's claim. He had gained temporary custody and a quieter danger, the knowledge that powerful men would either weaponize the image or bury it. He tightened the strap of his satchel and set his feet toward the coast where the chemist waited. The vault door locked behind him with a definitive clang. He did not wait to be asked twice. At the quay, Envoy Gregor yanked the leather satchel, while Envoy Cassian shoved his shoulder against the cartographer's ribs and bared a torch like a verdict. "Give the map." "Gregor, give it now," Cassian added. Suspicion tightened his jaw. He slid his hand to the satchel strap and felt the small sextant's metal bite his palm. The river smelled of rot and wet rope. He spat that detail into the gap of their shoving hands and, without stepping back, set his feet against the slick stones. He knew what they wanted. The map had already burned under candlelight in the scriptorium and at the council table. Its stained center had caught torchlight and set the hall to arguing. The memory of the smear on the oaken table from the council at the meridian sat in his teeth like grit. "He has it," Gregor shouted to the quay, and two other cloaks moved from a shadowed arch. Aveline's name flicked through him like a ledger falling open. He had expected allies to appear, but never at night in the rain. Slicked mouth of the river. The envoy shoved again. The cartographer twisted, planting his foot against the stone, and with his free hand he pushed the satchel toward the water, as if willing the leather to sink. "Stop." A voice cut. Lady Aveline stepped between the torchlight and the river. Her gloves were damp from the quay rail. She took the satchel from his hands as if carrying another person's burden, and did not examine it. She did not lower her eyes. "Put away your torches," she said to Gregor. "Speak plainly." Gregor spat. "Lady Aveline, this is not for bargaining. The bishop sends us. The parchment names a pit at the marsh. It calls for ordnance. It calls for purging." The cartographer watched Aveline's face. He felt a second emotion bloom under suspicion. Anger, quick and hot in his throat. He did not trust Gregor's mouth. He had not trusted the council's flat faces when they bent over the oaken table. He saw the smear in memory again, how the red dye sat like a wound at the map's heart. He tapped his ink-stained fingertip against his lip, and the action steadied him. "Bishop Marcellus wants a ritual, Aveline, but he cannot carry it without a sign. The map gives him one. You arrived at the quay when we called. Gregor, you answer to the bishop too." Aveline met his glare. "I answer to the kingdom's claim." Gregor. "The map belongs to the truth. The truth burns children." Cassian. Aveline's hand tightened around the satchel strap. "We will speak in the cloister," she said. She turned to him. "Come." Now, they moved along a narrow alley beside the cathedral. Lantern light carved the paving into rectangles. He kept one hand on his satchel and the other on his quill case until they reached the cloister's first arch. He did not trust Aveline yet. Suspicion drove him to watch her hands as she moved. When they paused beneath the carved saints, she did not release the satchel. "Why drag me through the quay, Aveline?" he asked. She thumbed the signet at her throat. A plain ring that was not the compass rose on his own hand, because the envoys were not going to wait. Because the bishop thinks the map will excuse what he plans. Because you read ink where others read order. Her words shifted something. His anger melted into a tight, nervous calculation. He had come as a scholar, methodical and slow, but the map had always dragged him into action. That pull, curiosity sourcing into duty, was the second emotion change, from anger into reluctant resolve. He followed her into a narrow corridor that smelt of damp stone and boiled leather from the council chambers. She closed the carved door behind them. Inside the cloister, Aveline spoke without looking away. "They will claim the pit is a demonic breach. They will say the map proves it. If they consecrate the marsh, men will die. If the bishop raises a ritual, the county will follow. He laid a palm flat on the satchel. The brass-rimmed spectacles were warm against his chest. Then we keep it safe, he said. Aveline's laugh had no humor. Safe. The map changes meaning in the air around it. Aldrich believes in sigils. Thomas denies everything. You watched the smear at the scriptorium. You know that someone darkened the margin. Thomas admitted it. The cartographer, he stained the parchment to test a binding technique. Aveline's eyes narrowed. Did he say how he stained it? He answered, a dark dye, red mixed with a black ink that refuses to lift with water. He used his apprentice not to hide the edge of the smear. He was trying to bind spirits into place. His voice was flat. He listed the technicalities the way a man lists weights. The action of listing was his steadiness. They arranged a meeting in the ruined chapel behind the scriptorium before dawn. Master Illuminator Aldrich waited with Thomas by a collapsed altar, dust still in the carved saints' hollows. Aldrich had the habit of cradling his spectacles on his nose and squinting at the parchment like a mason reading a foundation. Thomas washed his hands on his robe and did not meet the cartographer's eyes. Aldrich tapped the map and the light hit the new sigil. He used a small bone stylus to trace the hidden inscription until the letters showed under the solstice light, thin strokes that folded the compass lines into a small gate. The lines match the meridian angle for 2 days from now. Aldrich, the ink swells when it faces the sunrise. That is not natural ink. Thomas' confession came out in a rush as if it had been held in the throat too long. I smeared the margin with dye, he said. Not for binding. For a mark. I thought it would call pilgrims. I am sorry. I did not know it would make the ink react to the sun. You did know. The cartographer, not as accusation but as measurement. He watched Thomas' hands. Thomas folded the sleeves of his robe like a man trying to hide his wrists. The cartographer moved closer, pressed a fingertip to the stained edge where the apprentice's knot had been hidden, and felt a raised seam in the parchment. Thomas' voice broke. I wanted them to look. I wanted the bishop to notice land near his lordship. I did not mean. Aldrich cut him off. Intent matters less than result. The map is a tool now. The bishop will wield it to shape men. He will make the marsh a law. He will make the marsh a stage. Aveline paced. We have to stop the ceremony. If they finish the geometry, the solstice will open whatever the parchment points to. The cartographer felt fear uncoil in his stomach like a rope pulled taut. The emotion moved him from cold calculation to urgent motion. Fear sharpened his decisions. It made him do what he had not allowed himself the day. He stayed bent over the scriptorium and traced marginalia for hours. He found his compass, rose ring and rubbed it between his fingers until the metal warmed. They left the ruined chapel at dawn, taking the cart road toward the marsh. The road was a ribbon of churned mud and rutted wheels that led through fields where shepherds kept to the far borders. He walked with Aldrich and Aveline. They spoke little. The cartographer measured the angle of the sun as it rose and checked the map under a linen cloth to avoid curious eyes. When the first gulls lifted from a drainage ditch, he folded the map flat and placed the satchel on the cart beside them. On the verge of the marsh they found the pilgrim camp. Tents clustered like spare bones. A ring of clergy had already been set with carved stones. Candles burned in iron dishes and the air tasted faintly of boiled hides and beeswax. Bishop Marcellus stood at the center of that ring, a tall man in layered vestments with a habit of speaking through the congregation like a preacher losing patience. Pilgrim Captain Ruan kept a hand on the hilt of a short dagger and watched the road behind them. Aveline stepped forward and did not bow. Bishop Marcellus, she said, this parchment is not proof of a breach. It is a manuscript. It cannot sanctify slaughter. Marcellus smiled without humor. Lady Aveline, always a scholar. You mistake ceremony for cruelty. We will bind mischief. We will end what eats our flocks. Ruan stepped in. We camp for the safety of all pilgrims, he said. Captain Ruan keeps order. The cartographer set the satchel on the central stone when the clerics were not watching and straightened. He felt eyes like pinpricks on the back of his neck. He did not want to hand the map to Marcellus. He did not want the bishop to draw the ink into ordnance and fold the county into a geometry of fear. Marcellus moved to the stone and, with gloved hands, lifted the cloth that covered the map. When the stained center took the sun at a low angle, the ink changed subtly. The black lines shivered and the red dye took a deeper hue. A small loop in the margin, one of the marginal demons that scribes sometimes drew to fill blank spaces, seemed to deepen its shadow where it met the smear. Someone began to murmur. A pilgrim woman in the back crossed herself so often her hand shook. The cartographer could hear the edges of Aveline's breathing. He felt a swing between two emotions, hopeful relief as the bishop prepared to do nothing violent, and fresh dread as the ink pulsed. The two states jostled. Marcellus placed the map on the carved stone and drew a small knife from his sleeve. He cut across a cord that had been stitched along the map's fold. The church must map the danger to destroy it, he said. Aldrich muttered, the fold is a binding touch. You should not. Marcellus did not listen. He raised his hand and the solstice light caught the sigil. Then the parchment's fibers shifted. The ink in the smear bulged as if fed from beneath. Marginal demons inked imps that had always been just doodles, stretched their claws and slid away from the margin like oil on water. A fissure opened in the peat beside the stone with a dry crack that smelled of sulfur and old roots. The ground around the ring sagged. Pilgrims stumbled. Ruin lunged forward and grabbed a woman as the earth gave a half step. The cartographer felt the map pull at him like a hand. He reached for the parchment and found it slick with a heat that tasted of iron. Pull it back. Aveline shouted, pull it back. Gregor and Cashen pushed through the crowd. They had followed the cart. Gregor's face had gone rigid with triumph. The map calls it forth. He cried. Thomas dropped to his knees and pressed both palms to the stone. It is my mark, he wailed. I did not mean. The fissure widened and the air from it tasted of cold fire. The marginal demons slid out and across the peat like ink-pursuing birds. One landed on the hem of a pilgrim's robe and then, startlingly, flared into a small mouth that screamed without sound. The scream did not leave the island. It curled inward like smoke and made the hair on the cartographer's forearms stand up. Fear, sharp now and raw, made his fingers tremble when he reached for the map. He had one choice in that instant, and action moved before argument. He seized the map, folded it with two quick hands along the seam where the bishop had cut the cord, and drew a searing coal from the brazier. The cartographer's signet was on his finger. He felt the metal bite as he pressed it where the fold would meet flame. The crowd pushed back a wave of cloth and stunted prayer. Bishop Marcellus shouted, "Stop him!" The captain ordered his men forward. Aldrich shouted technical terms about inks and binding that the cartographer did not hear over the noise. He held the map with his left hand and with his right he slapped the coal against the seam and applied the flame. Heat took the parchment. The fold clenched. The sigil bubbled and spat like fat on hot iron. For a second, the opening hiccuped, and the marginal figures convulsed. Something small and corrupt slipped through the stutter and clung to the spun peat like a stain. The fissure did not close. The aperture coughed out a faint corruption that lifted itself like an oil sheen and then vanished into the reeds. He felt the sting of the signet's metal on the skin of his palm as the ring heated and the silver blackened. The signet bent with the pressure where his thumb had pressed too hard. When he dropped the burned map onto the stone, people around him were slick with mud and candle wax and the scent of burnt linen. Aveline grabbed his sleeve. "Did you seal it?" she demanded. He breathed out, tasting iron and smoke. It stuttered. He said, "It did not close cleanly." Something slipped free. Aldrich swore softly. Thomas began to weep. Marcellus glared at him like a man whose gospel had been interrupted. "You branded the relic." The bishop accused. "You ruined the ceremony." Ruin shoved through. "What of the pilgrims?" he asked. "Did we save them?" A pilgrim from the ring moaned and pulled at his robe. A small hole had opened where the demon had landed. The flesh around it was puckered and grey. The woman clasped at her belly and then vomited black fluid that smelled of coal and iron. Panic spread in quick, human patterns. A woman screamed, and then another began to weep with hymn words halfway on her lips. The cartographer knelt beside the ruined map and, with hands that smelled of smoke, he tore out the burned quadrant where the sigil had been worst. He folded that scrap into his palm and saw that the compass, Rose's signet, was marred where he had pressed his thumb. The ring would never sit the same. He felt a new emotion move through him. Grief for the harm his curiosity had allowed. Grief showed itself as muscle memory. His fingers trembled, and he rubbed the sting along his palm. He did not ruminate in a bath of sorrow. He moved. He wrapped the remaining map in linen, placed it into the satchel, and rose. Aveline caught his shoulder. "We will not let the bishop keep the rest," she said. "We hide what remains." They retreated under the smoke and the ringing of the pilgrims' cries. That retreat was a small defeat. The bishop called for a guard to seal the island with writs and ritual knots. Marcellus would file the map into the church's registry and claim penitent work. The cartographer watched as two clerics argued with Aldrich about the map's custody. The argument contained 3 quick exchanges in which Aldrich accused Marcellus of ignorance. Marcellus accused Aldrich of pride, and Ruan warned both they were losing the people. In the dusk that followed, the survivors walked under hooded cloaks toward the cathedral. They carried what they could salvage. Thomas stumbled and Aveline steadied him with a hand at his elbow. Gregor trailed behind, eyes flicking like a man counting coins. The cartographer kept his satchel closed and pressed it to his chest, as if he might feel the map's pulse. They reached the cathedral's sealed crypt under a sky where the stars dipped low like lids. The crypt smelled of damp stone and old beeswax. Aveline set the linen bundle into a reliquary chest already curtained in darkness and hammered the lid with 2 iron nails. He placed the marred signet ring into the seam as if it were a key and let the iron slat scrape. The action of sealing was mechanical and precise. When the final nail struck, the echo in the stone felt like a verdict. Thomas knelt and begged Aveline for forgiveness in the way of a penitent. "I did not want this," he said, voice breaking into smaller pieces. "I only wanted them to look." Aveline's hand rested on his shoulder, steady as a ledger's weight. "You will learn to read the consequences," she said. "You will learn to measure ink against law." The cartographer looked at the reliquary and then at his bandaged hand where the signet had cut shallow lines. He felt the old suspicion return, but altered by another shift, from grief into wary watchfulness. He recognized the map as an object that continued to change men, not solely by its ink, but by the desire it provoked. He had folded and burned and sealed, and still something had slipped through. Outside the crypt, Aveline closed the gate and shoved the iron bar into place. She looked at him then, and for the first time without words she acknowledged the cost. He did not speak. Instead, he unclasped the satchel and handed her a small scrap of the burned quadrant. "Keep this," he said. "It will tell when the ink still reacts. If the smear wakes, you will see the seam." They counted their losses aloud. Thomas would be apprenticed under night watch. Aldrich would keep his lamp in the chapel and refuse public lectures for a time. Gregor and Cassian returned to the bishop with bruises and a tale that made them sound like men who had been right to fear. Marcellus would file his complaints and his writs. The cartographer kept his mouth shut about how the map had shifted when the solstice struck. He feared some among the council would call it miracle and others would call it witchcraft, and both would justify more death. Aveline touched the bandaged cut on his thumb. "You saved lives," she said. "But we are not safe yet," he nodded. He felt resolve harden again, this time a deliberate, practical resolve not easily undone. The emotion shifted from wary watchfulness into procedural resolve. He would act by record, by restriction, by burying the map inside law and stone. He would not leave it to chance or to a bishop's sermon. They wrapped the reliquary in an outer box and moved it into the cathedral's archive. Aldrich borrowed a key from an old registry chest and slid the bundle behind iron bars. He set 3 seals with wax and ink. One for the scriptorium, one for Aveline, and one for the cathedral. Each seal bore a small notation of who had handled the papers and why. The cartographer wrote in a tight, neat hand the events that had led them to the marsh and the burning of the fold. Record-making was his palliative. It turned fear into paperwork. Thomas came to stand by the archive door and pressed his forehead to the cold stone. "Will it come back?" he asked. Aldrich answered in the quiet that followed, hands resting on the ledger, "Not in the same way. The parchment is altered. The sigil is damaged. Whatever slipped free took only a tincture of the binding. But writings echo. A mark remains. They left the archive at last." The cartographer walked with Aveline down a narrow set of steps and through the cathedral doors into an evening that smelled of peat smoke. He carried the memory of the ruined map like a physical weight at his side. He thought of the smear at the oaken table from the council at the Meridian and of the burned quadrant now sealed behind iron. He understood, with the clarity that comes after decisions, that maps are not only instruments of location but of action. They change law, movement, ritual. Outside, a distant bell tolled. It sounded like the clocking of someone closing a book. Aveline paused and turned a key in her palm that matched the reliquary's notch. "We will watch the marsh at the next solstice," she said. "We will set watchers at the meridian line." He looked at the ring blackened and bent on his finger. The signet's compass, Rose had been marred into a scar. He touched the metal once and felt the groove where heat had eaten through. The final emotion that settled at the end of the night was a hollow caution, neither triumph nor despair, but a clean, nervous readiness. He had cut the map. He had burned the fold. He had seen what the parchment could do. When they left the cathedral crypt, a clerk from the council arrived at the gate with a sealed writ demanding access to the archive. He presented the seal with a bureaucrat's smile and a hand raised to the wax. Aveline did not hand the seal back. The cartographer looked at the clerk and, for the first time that night, spoke plainly in a way that would matter. "You will not take that chest," he said. "Not without all 3 seals broken in council here, in public, and with witnesses." The clerk hesitated and then bowed. "Very well," he said. "We will summon the council." They had won only a temporary safety. The chapter closed with a concrete act. The council would have to meet, claims would be recorded, and the reliquary would wait behind iron bars. He left with ink on his fingertips and a ring that would not fit the same way again. He kept the small scrap of burned parchment in his pocket, and when he walked he counted the steps by the names of those who had stood with him: Aveline, Aldrich, Thomas, Ruin, and the ones who had not. The map, folded and seared, lay framed between law and ruin. He had bent a gate closed. He had not assured it was sealed. The wooden hasp of the reliquary clicked once more as the clerk left, and the echo swallowed itself in stone. He felt suspicion still, but it now sat beside a practical habit: to measure, to chronicle, to prepare. He would return to the scriptorium the next morning and make new entries, list the fools and the brave, and set a watch list for the marsh. He had finished the immediate battle. The larger war, he understood, would be fought in the following councils and in the margins of parchments yet unrolled. The resealed chest was both an end and a ledger line. He lifted his coat against the night and turned away from the cathedral's stone mouth, feeling the signet's groove ache cold against his thumb as the bell finished tolling. He walked into the dark with Aveline at his side and the reliquary forgotten in the cathedral behind them. The iron bar clicked into place, and the sound of it still ringing when the doors closed for the night. That single, ringing click became the chapter's last action. A reliquary latched, a record made, a map folded and taken from common hands. The cartographer tightened his hand on the satchel and kept walking.